Hi everyone. This week we'll talk about Islamic movements and Egypt. Similar to last week, I want to start out by talking about several theories that explain or hope to explain or try to explain some aspect of Islamist politics, Islamism, whatever we want to call this thing. Then I want to look at some different phases in Egyptian history. I want to look at Islamic movements as anti-imperial movements under Nasser. I want to look at Islamic movements as anti-communist movements under Sadat during the 1970s and into the 80s. And then in the post-Cold War era, I want to look at Islamic movements as anti-Western movements, whatever Western is taken to mean. Then finally, I want to take a few moments to talk about the Arab Spring uprisings in 2011, the election of a member of the Muslim Brotherhood as president of Egypt in 2012, and his removal from power in 2013. Finally, I want to wrap this up by talking about the relationship of Islamic politics to democracy. First, we need to think about what we mean when we say Islamist politics or Islamism or political Islam. And thinking about these things is important because the United States government is currently at war with quote unquote radical Islam. So it would be good if we had a sense of what on earth is being meant when this is said. Two good scholars to start with are Bernard Lewis and Jihan Toural. Bernard Lewis is one of the most famous Middle East scholars of his era, which, as you can see, lasted for over 100 years. He was known for his studies on early Islam, and then later in life he wrote a number of more general books in which he took a very critical line towards modern Islamic society, arguing that Islam was inherently totalitarian and it produced unmodern, anti-modern thinking. So he's a very, I suppose we can say, conservative scholar when it comes to this issue. But even so, I think he has a very nice way of framing what Islamic politics is. So let's look at this quote, this long quote. Islam is a reality, and its importance as a political factor is immense. But having accepted Islam as a fact, we should remember that there are still other facts. Muslims, like other people, seek ways to protest and rebel against political oppression and economic privation. Muslims, like other people, will react and respond in ways that are familiar to them. Whatever the cause, political, social, economic, the form of expression which Muslims most naturally find to voice their criticism and their aspirations is Islamic. The slogans, the programs, and to a very large extent the leadership are Islamic. Through the centuries, Muslim opposition has expressed itself in terms of theology as naturally and as spontaneously as its European equivalents in terms of ideology. No one is more a mask or a disguise than the other. So what's he getting at? He's saying that Islam, after more than 1,000 years, is a culture. It's a set of symbols and histories and values that are understood by people, and people draw on these in order to protest when they are confronted with injustice, when they're confronted with something wrong in their societies. They frame their demands, they frame their protests, they look for leadership too. Islamic symbols, Islamic leaders, and this is natural. We see it in our own societies as well, where many civil rights movements have been led by religious leaders, where politicians talk about a crusade against this or that, where crosses are used as symbolism in campaigns. So this is something we kind of intuitively understand, and Lewis is saying here, in a fairly moderate way for Lewis, that this is to be expected. A later generation of scholars who came after Lewis would be even a little bit more extreme in their emphasis. They would say that Islam was part of Muslim culture, part of Middle Eastern culture, and it formed the basis for resistance to capitalist exploitation, Western imperialism, all these sort of things. So a generation of scholars after Lewis would start to say that not only is it natural that people are drawing on these traditions, but they're going beyond that. They're taking these traditions and they're using them for contemporary problems. Lewis didn't necessarily see it that way. What made him fairly conservative was that he thought Islam was tradition, traditional, anti-modern, and not something that could be used for moving forward. Other scholars saw it a bit different. They often saw Islam as a force for social progress. A more recent scholar is Jihan Toral. He's a sociologist at UC Berkeley. And he talks about modern protest movements, modern populist political movements. And he argues that Islam is not something that leads to popular protests, but rather it's a way in which popular protests are contained. So, in other words, when people are frustrated with their government, when they're frustrated with injustice, they have this inherent urge to resist, to stand up, to challenge an unjust system. And he's saying that Islam can be a way of containing these protests, shaping it and directing it. And the quote I have from him here, or the two quotes. First, he says, Islam, or rather Islam as it is interpreted by Islamists, so people who use it for political purposes, is not an instrument utilized once a populism emerges or once the conditions for its emergence are established. On the contrary, I suggest that Islam actively shapes this populism and imposes a certain form on it. Specifically, it defines the boundaries of inclusion and exclusion and determines who should be participating in this politics. So again, as I said, Toral is saying that Islam is a way of shaping and containing protest and also of defining who is part of the group that is protesting, that's challenging the system. So when a new political order takes shape, Islam and Islamic symbolism can be a way of saying who is on the inside and who is on the outside. And this is a process that we've seen in past weeks, I think you'll realize. And then also he adds, about a decade later in another piece he wrote, he talking about Turkey, he says, in Turkey, for example, we are witnessing the absorption of Islamism into a conservative project rather than the flowering of a full-fledged post-Islamism. So what's this mean? Well, he in particular, among scholars, argues that Islamic politics used to have more radical potential. In other words, the potential for remaking society from the roots up, for changing the social order, for changing the system. And he tends to argue that in reality what's happened is that Islamism has become co-opted into the system. Leaders have become rich, they've become owners of firms, they've become enmeshed in connections with the military, with politicians, and this has taken away the radical edge. This sort of argument I think you'll see repeated in the reading by Bayat this week, because he also, like Toral, thinks that Islamism has lost a lot of its revolutionary radical potential. So with these two scholars in mind, I want to talk about Egypt. The main thing I want you to take away from both these authors and from the reading this week is that Islam as a religion provides people with a set of symbols and ideas and ways of talking about ideas that help form political movements and that also help shape political movements. So they create the grounds on which people can challenge the state, can challenge injustice, but they can also form the way that challenges to the state and challenges to injustice are contained. So first off, I want to think about the movement in Egypt that first brought together politics and Islam in the modern era. And that group is the Muslim Brotherhood. You'll remember this map from last week. And as I said at the time, Egypt, at the turn of the century, in 1900, was controlled by the British. So even before World War I had ended, it was under British control. And the British controlled Egypt because they needed to control the Suez Canal, which linked the Mediterranean and the Red Sea onwards to India. So it's no surprise, perhaps, that the main anti-imperial movement of this era, the Muslim Brotherhood, originated near the Suez Canal. The Muslim Brotherhood was started in the town of Ismailia, which, as you can see from this map, is directly on the Suez Canal. Its founder was a teacher named Hassan al-Banna. Al-Banna had studied religion in his youth, but then become a teacher, moved to Ismailia, and while he was there, become disgusted with the power of the British government in Egypt and the influence of this foreign imperial power in Egyptian society. He blamed imperialism for many of the ills he saw around him in the industrial city of Ismailia. The Muslim Brotherhood started as an educational organization to teach literacy, to teach religion, to teach self-help. It also provided welfare to people at a time when the state wasn't providing welfare services. It spread rapidly, with tens of thousands of members after only a few years. By the 1940s, the Muslim Brotherhood was getting involved in politics. It tried to get candidates elected in 1942 and 45, but met with stiff resistance from the governing parties and from the monarchy. As a result, the Muslim Brotherhood developed an anti-system attitude. It saw the governing parties and the monarchy and the British as all allied with one another in order to maintain power and keep more popular parties, such as the Muslim Brotherhood, out of power. During this period, the Muslim Brotherhood's perspective overlapped in many ways with the view of nationalist officers such as Nasser. And during the 40s, there was a lot of meetings and organizational planning going on between these and other groups against the ruling parties, against the monarchy, against the British. In 1948, with the State of Israel's creation and the Arab-Israeli war that followed, the Muslim Brotherhood actually sent battalions of fighters to join in the conflict. Over the years, the Muslim Brotherhood had developed youth leagues, secret organizations, paramilitary wings, this type of thing. So it was already a quasi-military organization. Now it put that to use in fighting the Israelis. By the time of the Arab-Israeli War in 1948, the Muslim Brotherhood had something around 400,000 members. This made the Egyptian government very nervous, and in late 1948, the government moved to close the Muslim Brotherhood. At this point, the Muslim Brotherhood's secret organization assassinated the Egyptian prime minister. Several months later, Hassan al-Banna was also assassinated. I want to pause here for a moment and ask, what did the Muslim Brotherhood think at this point in the 1930s and 40s? What did Hassan al-Banna talk about? Well, I'm not going to read you all of these quotes. I'll just point to the first and one of the last ones, just to give you some sense of their ideas at this point. He argued, for example, that government should act in conformity to the law and to Islamic principles. The carrying out of ceremonies, receptions, and official meetings, as well as the administration of prisons, hospitals, should not be contrary to Islamic teachings. The scheduling of government services ought to take account of the hours set aside for prayer. Okay, so what's he getting at here? Well, he's basically saying that the way to have a better functioning society is to make society operate in accord with Islamic principles. What precisely these principles are, he leaves a little bit vague. And he's not really arguing for a government in which clerics are running things. Rather, he's arguing for a government in, again, kind of a vague sense where the people in power simply respect Islamic practice. Similarly, if you'll look at the bottom two examples I have here, he says male students should not be mixed with female students. Any relationship between unmarried men and women is considered to be wrong until it is approved. He also calls to censor theater productions and films, to be severe in approving films. So these are not particularly revolutionary ideas if you look around the world at the time. There's lots of censorship. There's separate education in many countries. But the principle he's operating under is that Islam and Islamic sensibilities, Islamic traditions should be the guide when policy is being made. This isn't precisely an anti-Western argument. Rather, it's saying that Western ideas should not be the metric by which Egyptian culture, Egyptian politics are judged. This is different from some contemporary politicians in Al-Banna's time. So Al-Banna's living during the 1930s. Well, that's the same time that Mustafa Kemal in Turkey is implementing lots of his westernizing reforms. And these reforms were based on the idea that Western civilization was the most advanced and should be emulated. Al-Banna is not saying that, say, science and technology are bad. He's just saying that because the West is doing it doesn't make it inherently good. It has to conform with tradition and Islamic values. Al-Banna was succeeded by Hassan al-Hudaybi, who was a fairly moderate figure in the party. He was opposed to some of the secretive organizations that had been created under Al-Banna. Hudaybi was also supportive of Nasser because the Muslim Brotherhood was opposed to the monarchy, opposed to the political class. They wanted the British out. They were opposed to British imperialism. Therefore, they backed Nasser, and they even backed Nasser when he took power from some of the more moderate officers in the revolutionary officer movement. So, in 1952, they supported the revolution, and in 1954, when Nasser took firm control, they also supported him. However, quickly, Nasser turned against the Muslim Brotherhood, at which point a member of the Muslim Brotherhood's secret apparatus, or a former member, tried to assassinate Nasser, and Nasser used this as an excuse to crack down even further on the Muslim Brotherhood. He arrested hundreds, thousands of members, prosecuted many of them, executed some, and for the next 20 years, the Muslim Brotherhood were a largely underground organization, or in prison, or in other countries such as Syria and Jordan. The following is a short clip of Nasser from 1966 or so, which should give you an idea of how he talked about Islamist politics and Islamist politicians in the years after the crackdown.
في سنة 53 كنا نريد فعلا مخلصين ان احنا نتعاون مع الاخوان المسلمين على ان يسيروا في الطريق الصحيح والطريق السليم. وقابلت المرشد العام للاخوان المسلمين وقعد وطلب مطالب. طلب ايه؟ اول حاجة قال لي يجب ان تقيم الحجاب في مصر وتخلي كل واحدة تمشي في الشارع تلبس طرحة. كل واحدة تمشي. وأنا قلت له يعني إذا الواحد قال هذا الكلام بيقولوا رجعنا لأيام الحاكم بأمر الله اللي كان بيخلي الناس ما يمشوش بالنهار ويمشوا بالليل. أنا في رأيي إن كل واحد في بيته هو اللي ينفذ هذا الكلام. فقال لي لا، أنت باعتبارك الحاكم مسؤول. قلت له يا أستاذ أنت ليك بنت في كلية الطب مش لابسة طرحة ولا حاجة، ما لبستهاش طرحة ليه؟ إذا كنت أنت إذا كنت أنت مش قادر تلبس بنت واحدة اللي هي بنتك طرحة، عايزنا ننزل ألبس 10 مليون طرح في البلد الناس.
As always with Nasser, those type of very lively speeches he gives can make you lose sight of the fact that under his rule, many people were in jail for long periods of time under somewhat flimsy pretexts. This might be the case with Hassan al-Hudaybi also. As I said, Hudaybi was a moderate within the Muslim Brotherhood movement, and one piece of evidence of this was the book he published Preachers, Not Judges. There's a picture of the book on this slide, which argued that Islamist politicians should work within the system. They should work within the existing political structures and not seek to overthrow them by violent means. This book was a challenge to other people within his movement who were arguing for more radical strategies. And the most famous of these radicals was Sayyid Qutb. As with Hassan al-Banna, I'll give you a few quotes from Qutb on the next slide. But the important thing to understand about him is he started as a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. But over time, especially once he was in jail, he started to advocate for more radical policies than other members. And again, I mean radical in the literal sense of the word, that he wanted to change the system from the root upwards, right? So he did not want to work within the existing political order. He argued that the existing political order was immoral, not according to God's will. In his famous book Milestones, and there's a picture of the book on the right-hand side of the slide, he argued that people currently lived in an age of jahiliyyah, which means stupidity, ignorance, a time where the truth of God's word is not clear to people. And what was needed instead was a political order in which God had power. So hakimiyya, where God reigned. This would be an Islamic state. While in prison, he developed a substantial following, and he was even released briefly due to outside pressure. However, he was quickly re-arrested, prosecuted, and executed in 1966. This is around the time, in fact, that Hassan Hubaydi published his book, Preachers Not Judges, in order to counter the popularity of Qutb's book. So what are some things Qutb was saying? You can read the top quote on your own time, but I'll focus on the middle and last one just quickly to give you a sense of how he wrote. He's saying, it's not the intention of Islam to force its beliefs on people, but Islam is not merely a belief. As we have pointed out, Islam is a declaration of the freedom of man from servitude to other men. In other words, only to God, right? Thus, it strives from the beginning to abolish all those systems and governments which are based on the rule of man over men and the servitude of one human being to another. Similarly, he writes, when Islam strives for peace, its objective is not that superficial peace which requires that only that part of the earth where the followers of Islam are residing remains secure. The peace which Islam desires is that the religion, i.e., the law of the society, be purified for God, that the obedience of all people be for God alone, and that some people should not be lords over others. So I think you can get a sense from these quotes and from the other quote as well, that he takes a much more strident line towards compromise, to who can be part of the political community, to whose views, whose symbols, whose beliefs can be included in a society. So I think we see a distinction between what he's saying and what al-Banna is saying. And Qutb, because perhaps he offers a more radical vision, he became very popular after he died. And student movements, as we'll see in just a second, took him up and liked what he was saying. And even contemporary militant Islamic organizations of the last 20 years look to him for inspiration, because he offers not so much a thoroughly worked out idea of what a political system should look like. Just like al-Banna, he's fairly vague, but he's so strident in the way he talks about it that it's appealing to people who are looking for sort of a moral clarity, if not a specific program. As we've seen, the Muslim Brotherhood under al-Banna developed in an anti-imperial context. Al-Banna was seeing the effects of British presence in Egypt, and he was developing his program, his critique of society, in relation to this. I think you can also see how it could be described as anti-Western or some other way of putting it. But I want to emphasize that in these years, the push was anti-imperial. get the British out, and then consolidate national strength. That's why the Muslim Brotherhood at this time initially backed Nasser in the military. As we can see in the 60s, once this link between the military and the Muslim Brotherhood split, you start to get these figures like Qutb who are advocating something rather different. Now, during the 70s and 80s in Egypt, we see the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamic politics in general being used as a way of supporting markets, capitalism, and opposing communism. This had already been happening in other countries, in Iran, for example, or in Turkey, but specifically in Egypt, we're going to see it develop more in the 70s. The resurgence of the Muslim Brotherhood in the 1970s was on account of Anwar Sadat, the president. As we talked about last week, Sadat wanted to distance himself from the socialist policies of Nasser. He wanted to open up the economy. He wanted to move Egypt out of the Soviet orbit, where it was getting a lot of its weapons, and create a closer link with the United States. So he pursued peace with Israel, closer relations with the US. And to do all of this, he needed to have his critics on the left silenced. So one way he did this was to allow religious groups to organize. When Sadat came into office, he let many of the imprisoned Muslim Brotherhood leaders out of jail, and he allowed them to start returning to their regular lives and then start organizing after that. In addition, he expanded education at the university level. The number went from 200,000 in 1971 to 400,000 by 1975. So university enrollment doubled, and he did this because he wanted to increase the social base of his regime. He didn't want to just have it be kind of professional people in the cities who tended to be socialist or to the left. He wanted to have rural people also come into the system as well. This strategy of Sadat's was very successful. The Muslim Brotherhood became particularly influential in the north of Egypt, so in places like Cairo and Alexandria, and in Upper Egypt, so in the south, where the Nile is up the Nile, you had more radical groups becoming influential in universities, and beyond the university too, in the cities. So you had religious groups starting to exercise more control over neighborhoods, over people's everyday lives, ad hoc morality patrols going around in some areas, especially in poorer areas of even cities like Cairo. This became a problem for Sadat and then after him Mubarak because, for example, in the case of Sadat, opposition to his economic policies started to be voiced in terms of Islam and Islamic symbols and Islamic ideas of justice. And I'm going to show you a clip in just a second that shows Sadat's reaction when a leader of the Muslim student organization, Gama al-Islamiyya, challenged Sadat at a forum that Sadat hoped would be kind of like an open public forum where Sadat would listen to the people and answer questions from different representatives in society, professionals, students, that type of thing. Let's take a look at how this interaction went.
يا فندم لو سمحت حضرتك في فرق بين ان واحد ينافق سيادتك وفرق ان حضرتك تقبل النفاق. كلامي واضح جدا.
لا
يعني ممكن انا انافق سيادتك
اسمع اي
وممكن
كلام
حضرتك ترفض
لان
النفاق.
ده خرج عن حدود الادب.
في ايه يا فندم؟
الزم مكانك، الزم مكانك وحدودك. ومن اليوم يا اولادي انا جايبكم عشان اقول لكم هذا. من اليوم الاحترام للقيم وللمعاني. الدين ما قالش انه يقف ويقول هذا الكلام امام رئيس العيلة، رئيس البلد اللي سمح له يجي عشان يقول رأيه بصراحة. دي ماهش من الدين اطلاقا. كنت اتصور انه وانت سايب دقنك ما تصدرش منك هذه اللهجة ابدا. ولما تيجي هنا اعرف ان في حدود. اتفضل اتفضل. لا اتفضل اتفضل.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
As you can see, tensions were already running high between Sadat and Islamic student organizations by the late 70s. Sadat's assassination by an Islamic organization increased the tension between the government and Islamic movements. On the other hand, Sadat's successor, Mubarak, also was trying to open up Egypt to foreign investment and marginalize more left-wing groups. So he also allowed the Muslim Brotherhood to contest elections, to organize, to be involved in politics and involved in charitable organizations during the 80s. As I talked about last week, Mubarak's military commander also played up his religiosity, the fact that his wife wore a veil, this type of thing. So you had the same dynamic going on under Mubarak as under Sadat, of the president using Islamic groups as a way of pushing to the margins the more left-wing, anti-capitalist opposition. Though within the Islamic movements there was also anti-capitalist sentiment and demands that the government provide more welfare. On the whole, Islamic organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood supplemented the government's attempts to reduce the role of the state, reduce the state's provision of welfare services, because the Muslim Brotherhood was willing to provide charitable giving to people, to provide welfare services. So as the state was withdrawing, the Muslim Brotherhood and similar organizations were filling the void that was left. The main area where there was divergence between the state and the Muslim Brotherhood was on issues such as closeness with Israel. During the course of the 1980s, you had a divergence between the government and different sorts of Islamist organizations. The government allowed the Muslim Brotherhood to operate within certain constraints. Meanwhile, the government increasingly was cracking down on more radical groups, including some of the student organizations that had formed in the 1970s, and some of the groups that had taken control in poor areas of cities. So you started to have more radical anti-government organizations forming during the 80s and more violence and tension. As we move into the 90s, what's going to happen is that these groups especially start to form a critique of the government that's both anti-government and more broadly anti-Western, and anti-Western in the sense of anti-American, because the American government is seen as propping up the Egyptian government, and the Egyptian government is seen as being corrupt, being too close with Israel, too close with imperial powers. So we're actually getting back to that original critique that Islamic organizations had during the 1930s, 1940s. During these two phases I've talked about so far, I want to emphasize that it's not that Islam is inherently anti-capitalist or anti-imperialist or anti-communist. What's going on is that Islam as a culture, the references, the symbols, the sense of community that's invoked when people talk about Islam, is being used for these purposes. So in the case of the Muslim Brotherhood and Hassan al-Banna, Islamic symbols, Islamic ideas, Quranic references are being invoked in order to justify an anti-imperial politics. Likewise, under Sadat and Mubarak, Islam and appeals to Islam and religious values are being used in order to push an anti-communist, anti-socialist, pro-market political agenda. All that's worth keeping in mind in this final section, because I put anti-Westernism in scare quotes because it's not that Islam or Islamic politics are inherently anti-Western, whatever we even mean when we say Western. It's rather that the people who are using those politics are often using it with this claim. Politicians in places like the United States are making the claim that certain things they want to defend. It could be the free market. It could be certain types of rights for women. It could be certain political organizations. It could be certain military agreements. That these things are, quote unquote, Western, and therefore opposition to them is anti-Western. At the same time, we can see in countries such as Egypt, other political actors, other political organizations also claiming that certain things are, quote unquote, Western, and these are things they might not like, such as religious diversity, or rights for women, or capitalist exploitation, or the existence of the State of Israel, or U.S. military presence, or freedom of the press. In other words, what is chosen by people in, say, Egypt or, say, the United States as Western or not Western is a subjective political choice. There's nothing inherently Western or non-Western about these things. It's the choice to make them as such that matters. So what we see in the 90s is that political movements in places like Egypt started to define certain things as Western and therefore needing to be resisted, often violently. A good illustration of what I'm talking about is Ayman al-Zawahiri. So Zawahiri follows this trajectory I've been talking about. He's born in 1951, so he's too young to really remember the revolution that brought Nasser to power. He wouldn't have been part of Hassan al-Banna's movement. But by the time he was a teen, he had started reading the works of Sayyid Qutb, and he was inspired by Qutb. He studied medicine at University of Cairo, and he became involved in Islamic student politics during these years. He wasn't representative of the trends I was talking about before, in the sense that he wasn't from a rural area. He was from a fairly upper middle class family. His parents were definitely intellectual types. But nonetheless, he was part of the student organizations of the 70s. After university, he worked as a doctor in the army for a time, and then he also worked as a doctor for the Red Cross in Afghanistan. Now, Afghanistan during the 1980s was the focus of a lot of militant activity, because the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan in 1979 in order to prop up its puppet regime there and ensure that there wasn't an Islamic revolution as there had been in Iran. Well, the US countered this by backing lots of anti-Soviet militant groups in Afghanistan, and these groups tended to use Islamic symbols, Islamic references, calls to Muslim solidarity as the way of justifying their resistance to the Soviets. And this was very inspiring for people like Zawahiri and other people you've probably heard of, such as Osama bin Laden. So during the 80s, there was a lot of militant organizing in Afghanistan, with US money pouring in, Saudi money pouring in, all to support this resistance to the Soviet Union. Zawahiri came back to Egypt and became involved in organizations like Tanzim al-Jihad, which means the struggle group, right? The group of jihad. And in this organization, he became involved in efforts to overthrow the Egyptian government, because he subscribed to this idea that Sayyid Qutb had of fighting the near enemy first rather than the far enemy. So the near enemy was the domestic regime, the Egyptian regime. The far enemy might be understood to be the United States or the West, or what was propping up the Egyptian regime. Over the course of the 1990s, Zawahiri and members of many other militant groups shifted their focus from confronting the near enemy to confronting the far enemy. And in the 90s, there were a number of events that were sort of intermediate. For example, attacks on foreigners in Egypt in order to destabilize the Egyptian regime. The most famous example of this would be the Luxor massacre in 1997, which killed 58 tourists at one of the most popular tourist destinations in Upper Egypt. The attack is thought to have been carried out by either Zawahiri's group, Islamic Jihad, or perhaps Gama al-Islamiyya, which was one of these 1970s student groups that had become more radical in the 1980s and 90s in the face of government crackdowns. After the Luxor massacre, the Mubarak regime started cracking down even harder on Zawahiri's group and other groups like Gama al-Islamiyya. And these groups, in turn, started changing their focus to the far enemy, bombing US embassies. Zawahiri's group linked up with Osama bin Laden's group, Al-Qaeda, which was the premier group advocating fighting the far enemy rather than the near enemy. And so by the time September 11th occurred, Zawahiri was part of this network of militants. And when Osama bin Laden was killed in 2011, Zawahiri became the new leader of Al-Qaeda.
من أهم الجوانب التي يعني يلمسها الإنسان إذا عاشر الشيخ أسامة بن لادن رحمة الله عليه رحمة واسعة والحقنا به في الفردوس الأعلى أن الرجل كان وفيا جدا لإخوانه، وكان يعني حريصا على أن يذكرهم بالخير وأن يشيد بمآثرهم، ولكن كان يحزن يعني في نفسه حزنا شديدا إذا أحس أن إخوانه على درب الجهاد قد ظلموا أو لم يأخذوا حقهم. كذلك كان الشيخ يذكر بالخير والعرفان، ويتأثر عند ذكر الإخوة 19 الذين هاجموا هبل العصر أمريكا في البنتاغون مقر قيادتها العسكرية وفي نيويورك رمز قوتها الاقتصادية، وكانت الطائرة الرابعة في طريقها إما إلى البيت الأبيض أو إلى الكونغرس، فكان يذكر هؤلاء الإخوة بالوفاء الشديد.
The point to emphasize with someone like Zawahiri is that the anti-Westernism they espouse is very subjective to what they are trying to achieve politically. In his case, he's trying to achieve political power in order to impose the version of Islam he thinks society should follow. The things he thinks are Islamic or un-Islamic, he says are Western, and so he opposes them. But again, it's a subjective understanding of what is and is not Western, what is and is not Islamic. And so the Islamism he's using is simply drawing on Islam for his own purposes. And the same could be said of many other groups too. Now, by 2011, when Egypt has the Arab Spring and revolution, you have these dynamics I've been talking about at play. You have these radical groups, militant groups, violent groups, and you also have the Muslim Brotherhood, which is generally more moderate, more willing to work within the system. And you have the Egyptian government of Mubarak still in power. And it likes to sometimes include the Muslim Brotherhood, sometimes not. And one way in which it cracks down or doesn't crack down on the Muslim Brotherhood is to associate the Muslim Brotherhood with these more militant groups. So there's this balancing act that the government is engaged in on the eve of the Arab Spring, sometimes letting the Muslim Brotherhood in, sometimes not, sometimes drawing on Islamic rhetoric to justify its policies, sometimes not. In the Arab Spring in 2011, we see a very similar dynamic play out in Egypt to the one that occurred, say, in the 1950s. So again, what we see is popular protests against the Mubarak regime. We see the military, as I talked about last week, no longer as close to Mubarak as it once had been, and so not necessarily willing to support him against the protesters. But once Mubarak is removed from power and free elections are to be held, who is the military going to support? Well, as you saw in the Abu al-Magad reading last week, the Muslim Brotherhood and the military essentially came to an agreement whereby the military was able to maintain a lot of its prerogatives, its influence in the economy, its control of its budget, in return for allowing the Muslim Brotherhood to field a candidate in the election, have that candidate be elected. So you had this agreement between the military and the Muslim Brotherhood in 2011, 2012, and that broke down over the course of 2012. The Muslim Brotherhood tried to gain more control over the state, more control over the military. President Morsi removed the military head and replaced the military head with someone he thought would be more supportive of him, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. Unfortunately for Morsi, this did not prove to be a wise political move. And when protests swelled against him on the one-year anniversary of his election in June 2013, Sisi and the military turned against Morsi and removed him. And now, as we know, Sisi is the president of Egypt. So this is the broad outline of events during the Arab Spring. I just want to focus on a couple specific details just to show you how the events fall into this larger narrative I've been telling you. So to do that, I want to think about Mohamed Morsi. Similar to more radical figures like Zawahiri, Morsi was also a university student in the 1970s. In fact, if you notice, he was born in the same year as Zawahiri. But unlike Zawahiri, he did not become a violent militant or advocating radical policies. Rather, he was more of a moderate. He studied in Egypt for undergrad, and then he came to America to get his PhD in material sciences. He even taught for a while at California State University Northridge before coming back to Egypt and working as a lecturer for many more years. During the 90s, he became involved in politics, and in 2000, 2005, 2010, he ran for office. He even served for several years in parliament. He was an independent because the Muslim Brotherhood wasn't allowed to run as an official party in those years. Now, when there was a presidential election held in 2011, the main Muslim Brotherhood-backed candidate was disqualified by the military because of radical connections. So the second choice for the party was Mohamed Morsi, and he won. As president, Morsi alienated various segments of both Egyptian society and the international community. Internationally, he made the United States nervous because he was saying very stridently anti-Israel statements. Domestically, he began to alienate the military because he was trying to get more power for himself to counter the military's power. He was making moves to assert his control, some of which we've talked about already. He was also trying to assert his control over the judiciary because he didn't feel that he had control of the judges and courts were ruling against him. And beyond that, the Muslim Brotherhood itself was seen by many voters as being too secretive still and pushing its own policies without openness and without public consultation. So across the board in his first year, he was alienating different groups and losing his base of support. A particularly striking example of the kind of controversies that were engulfing the Morsi administration by 2013 is that in 2013 he appointed as governor of Luxor a politician who was a member of Gama al-Islamiyya, which is one of the groups, you'll recall, that was thought to have been responsible for the massacre of tourists in Luxor in 1997. So this we can see as a particularly striking example of ways that Morsi was scaring the population, alienating international audiences, and making it very easy for protests to potentially topple him. By 2013, there was a protest movement developing against Morsi and a petition circulating calling for his resignation. Critics of his opponents, so people who support the Muslim Brotherhood or simply don't like the opposition to Morsi, sometimes say that this is all a military engineered plot to push him from power. And certainly the military was tired of him as well, but there was general popular opposition to him too. And the protests against him in many cases were larger than the protests that had formed against Mubarak. To give you a sense of Morsi, I'm going to show you another clip of him speaking, and I apologize again for this clip because it's clearly, it's from YouTube and it's clearly from a very pro-Morsi Muslim Brotherhood group. And so there's this swelling music behind him as he's speaking. It's very dramatic stuff, which makes it a little bit hard to hear. But as you listen to it, I want you to think about how this must have felt to Egyptians watching it. Because this is a video that's meant to make Morsi look good, make him look appealing, make him look like a democratic leader. So think about that as you're watching him talk and think about how you might react to a similar speech.
حافظوا على مصر، حافظوا على الثورة. الحفاظ على الثورة اللي احنا اكتسبناه بعرقنا وبدم شهدائنا وبمسيرتنا 2.5 سنين. حافظوا عليها كلكم يا مؤيدين ويا معارضين. اوعوا الثورة تتسرق منكم بأي حجة. الحجج كتير والسحرة كتير والتحدي كبير وانتوا قادرين تواجهوا هذا. ازاي نحافظ على الثورة؟ ازاي ما تتسرقش مننا الثورة؟ انا قدامكم ثورة 25 يناير وتحقيق اهدافها كاملة والحفاظ على الشرعية. ثمن الحفاظ عليها حياتي، حياتي انا عايز احافظ على حياتكم كلكم. انا عايز احافظ على الاطفال ولادنا اللي هيجوا يكبروا بعدنا. انا عايز احافظ على البنات هيبقوا امهات المستقبل اللي بيعلموا ولادهم ان ابائهم واجدادهم كانوا رجال لا يقبلون الضيم ولا ينزلون ابدا على رأي الفسدة ولا يعطون الدنية ابدا من وطنهم او شرعيتهم او دينهم. اذا كان الحفاظ على الشرعية ثمنه دمي انا فانا مستعد ان ابذل ذلك رخيصا في سبيل هذا الوطن واستقراره حسبة لله سبحانه وتعالى. حسبة له سبحانه وتعالى. اوعوا حد يضحك عليك، اوعوا تقعوا في الفخ اوعوا تفرطوا في الشرعية. ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب. لنتذكر جميعا الله سبحانه وتعالى هو يخاطبنا والله غالب على أمره ولكن أكثر الناس لا يعلمون.
In addition to giving you an idea of Morsi's style, I think this clip is fascinating because it draws on so many of the themes we've been talking about in this class, such as who is the community? Who does the state represent? How are men and women to participate in the state? What are their roles? How must they comport themselves in order to be part of the community? Because Morsi's talking about all those things. He's saying that women have roles as mothers, right? Men have roles as of defending women. We're all in this together if we perform our roles. He's also referencing God and talking about God as being his guiding light in making his policies. All these are different ways of talking about who's on the inside and who's on the outside. So is this democratic? Is it not democratic? I think obviously we can see that it's both, right? We can see how Islam can be used as a set of symbols that create a sense of community into which people can be included, or potentially Islam can just as easily be used to create a set of symbols and ideal roles for people which exclude some people. In thinking about Islamism in Egypt, therefore, and someone like Morsi and some organization like the Muslim Brotherhood, there's not a clear answer as to whether it's democratic or not democratic, but rather we can see the ways in which it's potentially democratic or potentially undemocratic. Since Morsi was removed in 2013, the Egyptian government, Sisi's government, has followed a policy similar to Nasser's in which the Muslim Brotherhood is demonized. Sisi himself emphasizes his own personal piety, but politics that draws on Islamic symbolism and Islamic ideas that are outside the military or Sisi's control are pushed to the margins. Since Morsi was removed, Egypt has suffered a number of shocking, violent incidents. Perhaps the most shocking of these was the Rabaa Mosque massacre immediately after Morsi was removed, in which the army moved into a mosque complex to remove pro-Morsi protesters, and in doing so killed about 900 people and injured 4,000. Since then, many attacks have been carried out by more militant organizations, more radical organizations. These include attacks on Coptic, so Egyptian Christian churches in 2017. Also that year, in the Sinai Peninsula, 300 people were killed at a mosque after people from the community had turned over militants to the government, and in response, the militant organization had attacked the mosque as a reprisal. To say that there's no connection between all this violence I'm describing to you and Islam would be misleading. Yet, at the same time, to say that there's anything particularly or distinctly Islamic about this violence would also be misleading. Rather, what I would argue to you is that this Islamism we're seeing in Egypt is a political movement that draws on Islamic history, Islamic symbols, shared ideas by people who live in the Middle East, and it's using those in order to justify its political goals. And I think that's a very important distinction to keep in mind. It brings us back to those two scholars that I started with. Throughout this lecture, I've been making an argument that's very similar to Bernard Lewis's argument. I've been arguing that protest movements in places like Egypt draw on past histories, past traditions, past symbols. They draw on this shared collective understanding that I guess we can call Islam or Islamic. And they draw on those in order to make arguments. It's only natural. All protest movements do that. Everyone does that. We draw on the past and what we understand and what we have in common in order to make arguments for the present and think about the future. Because I'm emphasizing the present and the future, I think I'm making a slightly different argument to you than Bernard Lewis, because he would say that Islam is inherently traditional and that appealing to it is traditional and somehow not modern, whereas I disagree with that. I think what we're seeing is a modern phenomenon by modern people trying to understand how to live in the present world. There's also a lot of influence of Jihad Tural in what I've been saying to you. Tural argues that Islam isn't just something that we draw on in order to make sense of the present. He's also arguing that Islam and the symbols and histories associated with it can be used by those in power in order to shape protests and to shape movements and to contain opposition. And I think we see that too. We see that in especially the Sadat era. We see it most clearly, where Sadat was intentionally drawing on religion and appeals to religious commonality, religious symbolism, in order to contain protests coming at him from the left. But we also see that during the Mubarak era too, where military generals emphasized their own piety in order to show that whatever policies they were doing were not somehow against the nation, against the community, against justice. And we see it in 2011 as well. The Muslim Brotherhood drew on Islamic symbolism, Islamic tradition, as a way of organizing protest against the state, as a way of gaining power. There were other ways that the Muslim Brotherhood gained power too, that was drawing on political connections, economic connections, but appeals to Islam was one of the ways. Again and again, we see that Islam can be used as a means of politically organizing, of articulating demands, of calling for a more just society. On the other hand, we see that it can also be used as a way of controlling populations, directing demands and the desire that rulers see fit. Therefore, the relationship of Islam to democracy is not fixed. To the extent that Islam and references to Islamic culture and tradition are used to include people in one's idea of society and in one's idea of the state, then it's democratic. And to the extent that Islam is used to exclude people from power and exclude people from control over their own lives, it's anti-democratic. Here's your study question for this lecture. I hope you take some time to think about an answer, and I look forward to seeing you all on Thursday for discussion.
لسه